Welcome to this edition of On Liberty from the Centre for Independent Studies here in Sydney. I'm Peter Curti, a research scholar at the CIS, and it's a great pleasure to have your company this afternoon. Well, the world has watched with mounting horror as Vladimir Putin pursues his war against Ukraine. Russia's invasion of its neighbour, which posed no threat to Russia, has already caused huge amounts of human suffering and has quickly disturbed any complacency about the stability of the international rules-based order. This disruption to the rules-based order has grave implications not only for Russia's immediate neighbors and West European countries, it also has implications for countries such as Israel, with whom Russia has had a significant relationship. What impact is the war in Ukraine likely to have on the security strategy of Israel, a country which also faces instability in its region, most notably from Iran? And what of the impact on Jewish Ukrainians who have been confronted with devastation and displacement in their homeland, a homeland which has in its past a history of vicious anti-Semitism? Well, to assess the wider impact of the war Russia is waging against Ukraine, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. David Adler, President of the Australian Jewish Association. David, a very warm welcome to you. Great to have you.
Thank you, Peter, and a delight to be able to join you today.
Let me begin by asking you about the situation now confronting the Jewish community in Ukraine. What news do you have, and what do you hear from Jewish leaders there?
Well, the Jewish community has a very substantial history in the Ukraine. Uh, Probably at its peak prior to the Second World War, there were as many as 2.5 million Jewish people in the Ukraine, constituting close to one-third of the population that was devastated in World War II. There is a deep religious tradition. Some of the greatest sages in Jewish world came out of the Ukraine. People like the Baal Shem Tov, who founded the Hasidic movement, which became Chabad today, the largest Orthodox movement across the world. The Rabbi Nachman of Breslev, and various other luminaries. So it is very distressing to see the Jewish community being devastated. With little exception, on this occasion, they are not being specifically targeted. We have connected with a couple of the local rabbis to get updates. And the situation is grim, as it is for many of the communities across the Ukraine. When we see rabbis going into synagogues, collecting their Torah scrolls and walking out, some walking all the way to the border carrying their most prized possession, it does bring back ugly memories, of course. Israel is helping to the best that it can. Although, as we speak, only somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 Ukrainian Jews have emigrated to Israel. Many of them have crossed borders into Poland and other surrounding countries. So it is grim. It's looking ugly, as we all know. Residential areas are being devastated in many parts of Ukraine, and it's very, very sad to see a place with such deep Jewish tradition having its Jewish community hit so hard again.
You mentioned the Jewish refugees making their way to Israel. They're doing that with the assistance of the Israeli NGO, the Jewish Agency. Can you tell us something about the Jewish Agency, about its history and its work today?
Well, there are a number of organisations that are doing that, Peter. The Jewish Agency was founded in 1929. It describes itself as providing a global framework for Aliyah, which is the term for Jews in the diaspora who choose to migrate to Israel. Literally, Aliyah means elevation, to go up. There are a few organisations that are actively involved. The Jewish Agency is playing a major role. The Israeli government through the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. And I mentioned Chabad before, which is the largest Orthodox Jewish organisation in the world. It actually has 150 centres in the Ukraine, including the largest Jewish community centre in the world, which is located in the Ukraine. And there's a lot of cooperation trying to get people across borders. And there is a strong point worth making, Peter. Ukraine has an estimated 2 to 2.5 million refugees. They may have more very soon, unfortunately. The group that has a definite destination to go is the Jewish community, because of the role that Israel plays. And part of its constitution is to accept as citizens Jews who are under distress from anywhere in the world, and that is being activated right now, and the Jewish Agency plays a real role in doing so.
Of course, escape from bondage is an extremely important component of Jewish identity because of the exodus from Egypt, something represented by the Hebrew word Mitzrayim. Well, in a month's time, Jews around the world will be marking Passover, which commemorates the Exodus. I imagine that Mitzrayim will have a special meaning today for Ukrainian Jews, especially as they make their way to Israel.
You're right. I mean, some people regard Mitzrayim as the Hebrew word for Egypt, because it does relate to the time of the Exodus. But in Hebrew, it means a great deal more than that. It means a removal of bondage. It means freedom. It means being able to live to your potential. And at the moment, certainly the Jewish community in the Ukraine is suffering a lack of those attributes. I haven't heard the direct analogy with the Exodus and Mitzrayim before, but it's an interesting one. Another interesting one, and the timing of our event, our discussion today, is that this evening we start the holiday of Purim, and Purim is another holiday where there was an evil totalitarian regime that tried to wipe out the Jewish people. Fortunately, that ended in a much happier way. So we do need to learn the lessons of history and reflect on our traditions. And I think there's probably a little bit of Purim and a little bit of Mitzrayim, the relief of the Exodus that some of the Jews in Ukraine are going through at the moment.
Of course, one of the most significant leaders with a Jewish identity in Ukraine at the moment is the president himself, President Zelensky, the descendant of Holocaust survivors. And in recent weeks, Zelensky's standing has grown enormously. What bearing, if any, do you think that Zelensky's Jewish identity has on his role now as a wartime president? How do you think there are ways in which his Jewish identity has shaped his role?
Look, it's interesting that he's been calling upon Jews around the world to support the Ukraine, and of course many do. But I've got to be completely honest that Zelensky has a bit of a mixed history. He is a descendant of Holocaust survivors, as you say, and he is standing up against Russia, and I wish him every success. But if you look at the history of his administration, him personally, he has married a non-Jewish woman. His children have been baptized, so if you like, he's not carrying his Jewish identity forward through his family.
Right.
And then we received a report on how the Ukraine has voted in the UN on the numerous anti-Israel resolutions which appear before the UN. And in the time that Zelensky has been president, there have been 17 anti-Israel resolutions put to the UN. The Ukraine voted against Israel 13 of the 17 times.
Really?
And abstained 4. They not once of the 17 resolutions did the Ukraine vote with Israel. Now, having said that, on a humanitarian basis, Israel is stepping up enormously, not just for the Jewish community, but for the general community in the Ukraine. And I learned today that Israel is shipping over to the Ukraine a gift of some bulletproof ambulances.
Right.
Now, not many countries require bulletproof ambulances, but Israel has a few. And through the equivalent of its Red Cross called Magen David Adom, which means Red Star of David, today bulletproof ambulances are being shipped to the Ukraine. So that's really interesting. It's a really important gesture, and I think Israel, like other democratic countries, wants to do everything it can to support Ukraine. But I don't want to paint Zelensky as a saint. He's not. He's got a bit of a mixed track record, to be honest.
It's certainly, I think his standing has changed dramatically since the end of February when Russia did invade. I remember, commentators in the West had their doubts about whether he was capable of exercising mature political leadership. So I think the circumstances are testing him. But it's very interesting to know more about his background, and certainly the background to Israel, to the Ukraine's voting record at the UN, which I think often.
I think we've all been very much surprised by not just him, but the Ukrainian people generally across the board, the resistance that they have been able to mount against far superior military forces. And I'm sure Vladimir Putin is as shocked as anyone. He probably expected a victory within days, and now he's got forces that are bogged down there and at least struggling. Who knows what the end result will be.
But it's interesting to see that the West is holding whatever support is being offered to Ukraine. The West is holding back, or other, for the most part, it's the Western nations that are holding back from direct military intervention in the world. I think we're sort of seeing, as I mentioned in the introduction, the emergence of a brave new world of today's geopolitics, where the rules-based international order seems to have been upended. And in those circumstances, it looks as if Ukraine's best chance for survival is likely to be self-reliance rather. And of course, a country that knows a lot about self-reliance is Israel. What's the lesson of self-reliance, do you think, for a country like Israel? Or is it that Israel has lessons about self-reliance to teach other countries like Ukraine?
Well, I think there's a two-way lesson here, Peter. The first is you correctly observed that other countries are not physically helping the Ukraine in terms of military engagement. So the Ukraine is essentially on its own. And the lesson for Israel is very obvious, that probably its number one threat is Iran. Israel is very concerned that Iran might obtain nuclear weapons. In the event of an attack from Iran, which has sworn and in fact has legislation obliging it to destroy Israel. That's not widely known, but it does. Israel needs to understand that in such a conflict, it will be on its own. The other aspect of self-reliance, which we have seen emerge in discussion, is related to energy. And we know that parts of Europe are significantly dependent on Russian oil and gas. Germany, I think, gets 40% of its gas supply from Russia, which is enormous, and many other European countries are reasonably dependent as well. We know that the Biden administration opposed and stopped work on a pipeline from Canada, which would have enhanced energy security for the United States. What is less known is that the Biden administration in January this year also announced opposition to a pipeline called the East Med pipeline. That's not a medical intervention, it's short for Eastern Mediterranean. From Israel's offshore gas reserves, a huge gas reserves called the Leviathan Project, there is planned a pipeline through Crete to Greece and into Europe to enhance the energy independence of Europe, at least give it another source of supply. Israel provides gas to Egypt and Jordan, and there was a plan to extend that to Europe. So I think there's a lot of lessons about self-reliance, and probably the two at the top of the list are self-reliance from a military point of view and self-reliance from an energy point of view. And of course, these are lessons for Australia as well, Peter, which we need to consider.
Let me come back to Iran, if I may,
Mm.
because Russia has been friendly with Iran. Negotiations initiated, I think, by the Biden administration, really, on the joint comprehensive plan of action have been underway between Iran and the West, but they appear to have stalled now. What part did Russia have to play in that disruption? And how keen do you think Russia really is to avoid nuclear proliferation in the Middle East? I mean, we're seeing Vladimir Putin raising the stakes by talking about the use of nuclear weapons. Does Russia have an interest in promoting nuclear proliferation in the Middle East?
Well, one would hope not. The last information we had was that Russia was quite keen for a new JCPOA agreement and the lifting of sanctions from Iran. I guess with the West imposing sanctions on Russia, they're going to need every trading partner they can get. It is very complicated. Russia is embedded in Syria. Russia works closely with the Assad regime, and Iran, of course, largely controls Hezbollah in Lebanon, and also extends into Syria. So there is a strategic military power relationship between Russia and Iran. It exists as expressed in Syria and to a lesser extent Lebanon. Russia has moved anti-aircraft technology into Syria, the so-called S-300s. This has created a bit of stress with Israel. There is some behind-the-scenes coordination because Israel knocks off military supplies in Syria and Lebanon and doesn't want to accidentally shoot Russian assets. So there is a behind-the-scenes coordination. There's a bit of tension, but there is communication and cooperation. So if you wanted to find more complicated geostrategic politics, you'd have to search far and wide, because I think you've hit it there, Peter.
Because Russia, of course, itself has had closer relationships with Israel, certainly under the administration of Benjamin Netanyahu. And I mean, it would be probably stretching a point to say that there was an alliance between Russia and Israel, but certainly there have been friendly relationships between the two countries. How important do you think those relations with Russia have been for Israel, and what impact will the war in Ukraine have on those relations?
That's why Israel has been sort of fence sitting on some of the political issues. It has condemned the Russian invasion along with other countries. Vladimir Putin is not like the Tsars of old. He's not viciously anti-Semitic as previous leaders of the Soviet Union have been. In fact, we have seen him personally provide one of Russia's highest awards to the chief rabbi of Russia, Beryl Lazar. And there's a story that when he was a child, he was befriended by a Jewish family who looked after him when he had some tough personal issues. So there has been an improved relationship. It becomes more complex when you look at what's happening just north of Israel, because as the US has pulled out of that region. It's created a vacuum, and Russia has filled that vacuum of influence as a strong power in the Middle East. So it is working with Iran, it is working with Assad, and to maintain communications and a working relationship with Israel is important. I think the war with Ukraine is straining that relationship, but has not fractured it.
It's interesting to hear you talk about Putin's own attitudes to Jews, to Judaism, to the Jewish community in Russia, because of course in the Soviet Union there was a very long-standing campaign to secure the release of Jews, many of whom went to Israel and who enjoyed prominence in public life. What is the situation today like for the Jewish community in Russia itself?
Well, it's better than it was this time last century by a long way, and there are very successful people in the Jewish community in Russia. Some of the Russian billionaires are Jewish, and some of them personally have a strong relationship with Israel and a profile on the world stage. The owner of Chelsea Football Club is a Jewish Russian billionaire, although he said that he's going to sell the football club. So there's not really barriers now. We are hearing that it has caused the Jewish community in Russia also some distress, that the way Russia is treating people in the Ukraine, because there is a close relationship, and many of them have Ukrainian Jews and Russian Jews in the same family. And in addition to having applications from the Ukraine to emigrate to Israel, we are also seeing applications from Russia as well at an increased level.
Right.
Israel's expecting something in the order of up to 100,000 Russian Jews to arrive in the next year. I don't know if that number will be fulfilled, but that's a considerable number for a small country.
Indeed. I mean, in this country, the Australian Jewish Association is a leading Jewish organisation of which you're the president. What about the work that the AJA is doing with Australian Jews of Ukrainian descent?
There is a very focused Jewish community of Russian and Ukrainian descent in Sydney, in Bondi. The rabbi of the area, Rabbi Ullman, is well known to us, and we have been in touch with him, and he's actually been the one that has facilitated introduction to some of the Jewish community leaders in the Ukraine with whom we've spoken. And what can we do? We're doing all the things that we're being asked to do, to discuss the issue publicly, to pray in religious services, and we have provided the resources, the connections for those who want to donate to assist the community. We vetted a number of potential avenues and came up with the one that we think is preferred, and happens to be the Chabad Fund. And they're really the sort of things that the Jewish community in Australia can do. And we will continue to do that. We want the conflict to end. We think what's happening in the Ukraine is outrageous. We think we have a special obligation to support the Jewish community and to help those that want to go to Israel to do so. And if there are those that want to come to Australia, we would assist them as well.
Because it's been interesting to see that the positions of the federal government and the opposition have been very close on Ukraine, and there seems to be a really strong consensus across the what they call the political divide here. How satisfied are you that Australia is responding in appropriate ways to the to this crisis?
Well, Australia, we've got to be realistic, is a small player in this, and as far as we can tell, Australia is playing its role as a participant in applying the international sanctions, which are being done by other Western countries. And really, that's all we can ask of Australia. We're not suggesting that Australia should send our defence forces over there to fight. The only thing that we thought was a bit confusing was there was mixed messages as to how Australia would react to Australians who wanted to go to the Ukraine to assist. The foreign minister at one stage said that would be a crime. Other members of the government have basically said, while they're not encouraging it, they wouldn't advocate taking action against it. So I think it would be useful for Australia to clarify its attitude. But apart from that, I think Australia's behaving appropriately.
I think it's interesting because we are clearly living with a very disturbed international order, in which I think our reading of strategy, of geopolitics, and the relationships between the great powers and other nations will change. It's a very complex and rapidly changing situation. David Adler, I'm very grateful to you for taking time today to talk about the crisis in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, and the crisis confronting the Jewish community in Ukraine, and the implications for this crisis in the Middle East, and particularly for Israel. Thank you very much indeed for your thoughts and your contribution. And please know this comes with our very good wishes for your work at the Australian Jewish Association.
Well, we have a lot of respect for the work of the Centre for Independent Studies. We think that sort of research and voice is critical in a vibrant democracy. And as some of the political voices lose their way a bit, let us say, it's good to have organisations like the CIS who can speak on principle and with authority, and all strength to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, that's all we have time for in today's edition of On Liberty. David Adler, thank you very much again for being my guest today and for such an interesting discussion. And remember that On Liberty is presented by the Centre for Independent Studies each Wednesday at 12:30 in the afternoon. Please join us next time. For now, though, I'm Peter Curti, and thanks for your company today.